Buchholz Plant Introductions, Part 5. Let's continue with the Flora Wonder blogs. Buchholz Plant Introductions, Part 5, even though I sense that some of you have grown wary of my self-aggrandizement. But I feel a duty to summarize my contributions to horticulture, for better or for worse, before I become too feeble to recount them. And I'll attempt to set the record straight about my litany of false assumptions and misinformation that has previously been published. No holds are barred about my introduction failures because they serve to illustrate the reality that the valid and worthy have had to evaluate themselves above the mire of those mundane and worthless attempts. I discovered and introduced, or tried to, Abies Vigerii, Mountain Blue, which arose as a seedling that I germinated in the early 1980s. That was when I was working full-time at another nursery, and because I was cash-strapped, I grew a number of species from seed, and for a relatively modest investment, say $10, I could produce a couple hundred seedlings of an unusual species, and have a product for sale that nobody else even considered worthy of development. Of course, I had to assume that my crops were actually true to name, since I was growing these seedlings for the first time myself. One germinant distinguished itself for unusually vibrant, powder blue needles. It prospered, and eventually I was able to harvest scions, but the only problem was that no one would order an obscure species from northeastern Mexico, even my extra blue form. I eventually sold or dumped the remaining propagules so I could focus my energy on trees that were in high demand, and only the original Mountain Blue remained in my conifer field. After one particularly wet fall, winter, and spring, my solo went into noticeable decline. I let it be, unsightly though it was, hoping I could cut a few scions the following winter. But the wood looked too bad to bother when I went for the harvest. The Vigerii, as well as a nearby Abies, Duragensis coahulensis, were both tossed, and old Noah just sat in his ark shaking his head in dismay. The Vigerii species was first described in 1942 and was named for Octavio Villar Vázquez, the Mexican Minister for Public Education at the time. If you look for Abies Vigerii Mountain Blue online, you'll see a reference that claims it was found and introduced by the Buchholz Nursery. Talon found it in the high elevations in the mountains of Mexico. But of course you know that's wrong, and besides, I've never been in the mountains of northern Mexico. I have no desire to be in cartel land, where I'd be robbed and held for ransom, as I'm certain my family would refuse to pay up. In the 1980s, I acquired a monograph of the species Abies by the Chinese botanist Tang Shu Lu. I was intrigued by the Chinese species of Abies squamata, known as the flaky fir. It was virtually unknown in American collections, except that the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University supposedly had one. It was not easy to persuade the lofty plantsmen of Harvard to send a couple of scions to a little startup collection in Oregon, but they did. Unfortunately, they sent Abies chensiensis, or something else, but not the true squamata, which I realized a few years later. In the meantime, I had acquired Abies squamata elsewhere, which proved to be correct. To keep the true squamata separate from the false, I assign the name flaky to the correct source. This is a measure one must take in a commercial nursery setting with employees offering varying degrees of attention and commitment. Eventually, I sent back to the Arnold a start of the correct Abies squamata, for which I received no thanks, and today I don't know what became of that tree. Certainly, squamata is code hardly for Boston, USDA Zone 5. The late J.R.P. Van Hoey Smith of Arboretum Trompenberg in Rotterdam visited in the 1990s, and he marveled that I was growing Abies squamata at all, let alone one with a cultivar tag. I explained the Arnold mix-up story, but he dismissed it with a throat-clearing grunt, and later he was known to complain that when American nurserymen don't know the identity of something, they just invent a new name. I agree that the gripe is valid, so I'm guilty too. But since I had already released trees with the flaky name, even though it was not worthily distinguished for cultivar status, I have kept it to this day. If there's anything redeeming about my introduction, it's that I had made a rare tree available to American nurseries and gardens. I wrote in a 2014 blog, "The flaky bark fur from the Sichuan-Tibet border delights all who see it. The needles are rich blue-green and the cones are ornamentally purple. And when young, the species can attain a perfect Christmas tree form. The exfoliating cinnamon brown bark is fantastic, and I suspect that if I passed off some squamata trunk photos as Acer griseum, no one would question. AB squamata is native to a dry region, and it holds the altitude record of all ABs at 15,416 feet, 4,700 meters. Locally it is known as bolo, but then the Tibetans refer to other ABs and Picea species by the same common name. AB squamata is listed as vulnerable by the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, but I can produce lots of them should you want to grow it. According to the Royal Horticultural Society's Encyclopedia of Conifers 2012, Picea breweriana, emerald midget, is described. A slow-growing dense pyramid with ascending branches and rich emerald green foliage. In 10 years, 150 by 75 centimeters, 6 by 3.5 foot. Originated in 1983 as a witch's broom by Buchholz and Buchholz Nursery, Oregon, USA. I wonder the source of that information because it's not correct. It originated as a seedling, not from a witch's broom. And besides, if it did originate from a congested branch mutation, why wouldn't it be described as originating from a witch's broom, since there weren't any plural brooms? In any case, the original tree is still here, and it garnered a full-page photo in the encyclopedia. As to the alleged date, maybe I germinated the seedling in 1983, but it was never introduced until approximately 1990. I chuckle that the few Euro growers doubt that my specific epithet, breweriana, is correct. That surely it is a form of Picea omoriaca. But look at the buds. I admit that from a distance it resembles an omoriaca, but this Oregon boy knows his native Oregon conifers, and I can assure you that it is a Picea breweriana. In defense of the Euros, there is nothing at all weeping about emerald midget, and I've even asked myself what's the point of a dwarf brewer's weeping spruce if it doesn't weep at all. A brief description in the Royal Horticultural Society's Encyclopedia for Picea engelmanii blue magoo follows shortly after emerald midget, a slow-growing upright plant with short gray-blue needles. In 10 years, 180 by 120 centimeters, originated in 1986 by Buchholz and Buchholz Nursery, Oregon, USA. On the page preceding Blue Magoo is a full-page photo of Picea engelmanii Bush's lace. A nice photo, but the tree has a telltale sign of a damaged top where the apical shoot droops because it has been attacked by a moth that tunnels into the tree and lays its eggs, resulting in a dead leader and an unsellable tree. Certain species of spruce, such as Picea pungens, Picea engelmanii, Picea smithiana, and others are particularly prone, while other species are never afflicted. My solution for the problem is not to grow the faster upright spruces, and just to grow the dwarves that the moth ignores. So, I just had one Blue Magoo left at the Flora farm, and the RHS photo was taken just a year before its top died. In disgust, I removed the damaged tree entirely, reasoning that I never want to propagate a species if I can't grow it myself. My way of avoiding pesticide use. So long, farewell. Thanks for the memories. Pinus bungiana, temple gem, originated as a slow-growing, compact seedling selection, which I had set aside to observe sometime in the mid-1980s. All of its brethren seedlings eventually grew at the normal type rate, but Temple Gem plugged along at about 1/3 compared to the others. The original is still housed at Buchholz Nursery in the Short Road section, planted just a few steps away from the original Picea breweriana emerald midget, and along with the original Camasiparus ducentensis sparkling arrow, the first propagule of Acer palmatum geisha gone wild, and the original Acer circinatum sunglow. The little Short Road section is a veritable garden of earthly delights. I remember visiting the University of Tennessee's Botanical Garden about 10 years ago with employee Seth. The garden was rather small and just mildly interesting, but my opinion is not a put-down at all because any serious plant collection is of interest to me. Near the end of our visit, I sat to rest on a bench that was placed next to a pine tree. It didn't even register to me that the species of the bushy pine, but a few minutes later I realized it was a Pinus bugiana. And when I searched for the label, I was shocked to see it was a Temple Gem. Wow! How did that get here? I had never sent any plant to the University of Tennessee, but somehow there it was. My gem was in vigorous condition, and I didn't recognize it because the needles and new growth were larger than what I can achieve in Oregon. I was without my saw and pruners, but I had an urge to return one day to limb up the lower branches and thin the canopy to reveal the colorful, exfoliating trunk, to transform it from a boring pine blob into a show-off specimen. But alas, I have my own trees to take care of. Camasiparus obtusa, Moonshine, and Sunshine are both listed in the RHS Encyclopedia of Conifers, including a photo of Sunshine growing in full sun in our conifer field. Both originated about 1998 as a twig mutation and were first propagated on the exact same day. A colorful reversion appeared on a Camasiparus obtusa nanogracilis that became Sunshine, while a reversion on Camasiparus obtusa coasteri yielded Moonshine. Sunshine was produced for a few years, but it was prone to sun scorch, and when the unevenly variegated portions were large, then the plant would look dreadful. Surprisingly, in the photo in the encyclopedia, it doesn't look too bad. That was a graft onto Thuja occidentalis, but for me it would burn even in the protected greenhouses, so I stopped wasting my time with it. Camasiparus obtusa Moonshine is more evenly variegated and much cuter dwarf. It must be sited carefully in Oregon with afternoon shade, and even then it burns a little by the end of July. Moonshine will form a dense, low-spreading shrub stretching to 1.5 foot wide by 1 foot tall in 10 years. Oops! Wouldn't you know, there has already been a selection that's a look-alike to Moonshine, Baldwin's variegated. But I didn't know of it at the time mine was introduced. Moonshine is a better name for sure, and indeed it does light up a dark corner in the garden. As to be expected, plants propagated by cuttings will grow more dwarf than those grafted onto Thuja occidentalis, but we find a willing market however they are produced. Frequently, my crops of Abies coreana Icebreaker throw up strong, vigorous shoots. They can be quite thick and extend up to 10 inches long on an otherwise very dwarf plant. I decided to propagate the rambunctious stems, which I coined as Superbreaker, to see if the results would grow immediate between Abies coreana Silberlock, the mother tree of the original Icebreaker, and Icebreaker itself. Basically, I was seeking a more dwarf and compact form of Silberlock. Although that cultivar is plenty slow and compact anyways, I assumed that I was uniquely observant and curious, and I was poised to take the credit if my experiment yielded positive results. 3 years after the initial grafts, about 200, I revealed my trial to friend Neil Koels of Deurne, the Netherlands. but I discovered that the Dutch go-getter had done the same. And in fact, Nelis beat me to the concept a couple years prior. The jury is still out for me, and I don't know how Nelis had fared. But thinking at one point that the nursery's inventory might be liquidated, I have sold most of my Superbreakers in their 1-gallon pots. Also, when we ran a few short of filling an order for Icebreaker, I said we could sub with the needed amount of Superbreaker, for after all, they were Icebreaker too. But anyway, some supers are still here, and I hope that I'll be around to document the trial. Many years ago, I received scions off a dwarf Pinus parviflora that originated from the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University. Since I didn't have a name or a story to help identify the scionwood, I struck the name Arnold Arboretum Dwarf, and I propagated the attractive short-needle tree and introduced it about 1998. Trying to discover more about its origin, I was told that the Arnold's head propagator, Al Fordham, was probably responsible, as he was inclined to experiment with dwarf parviflora seedlings. One of his selections is listed in the RHS Encyclopedia as AA Special Number 2. And indeed, the accompanying photo looks similar to my Arnold Arboretum Dwarf. But I wasn't aware of the former's existence when I christened my cultivar. The name I bestowed was never intended to be a permanent cultivar name, and as happened often before, I have to throw some kind of identification name at the time of grafting. So the name Arnold Arboretum Dwarf is not clever or catchy in any way, but it's the one we're stuck with. The plant itself resembles a well-known Adcock's dwarf from the Hillier nurseries in England, named after their head propagator, Graham Adcock, in 1961, according to the Hillier Manual of Trees and Shrubs, 2019. I think the Arnold seedling is superior to the Hillier dwarf, and also the former is not afflicted with needle drop in early spring before the new candles push to hide the cruddy old foliage. For us, Adcock's dwarf always looked its worst in the middle of our shipping season, and I grew tired of making excuses, so we dropped it from production. In about 2013, one Pinus parviflora Arnold Arboretum dwarf developed cream yellow variegation on the otherwise gray-green foliage. In some cases, the stem would be entirely yellow, and at other times, just a few needles along the shoot would be differently colored. When one sees a 7 to 8-year-old specimen in the ground, the colorful portions are evenly distributed. But never have I considered the display to be dazzling. Flora distributes her gifts liberally, but they're not always wonders, which would be named Arnold's Variegated. The dwarf variegated Pinus parviflora is an appropriate conclusion to this week's blog. You can see that I'm trying to mix stories about the failures with the successes, because that's the true nature of plant introductions. If you are a specialty nursery or boutique garden center wanting the rare and exceptional plants your customers love, register as a wholesale customer on buchholznursery.com today.